The steam rose thick as morning fog when Hazel Darby pressed the heavy iron against the Colonel's white dress shirt, her practiced hands moving in smooth strokes that had become as natural as breathing after 3 years at Miller's Laundry in Salida, Colorado. She had learned early that perfection kept her employed, kept food on her table, kept the wolves of poverty from her door after her father died in the silver mines up near Leadville, and her mother followed him 6 months later from a broken heart. The year was 1883, and opportunities for a 22-year-old woman alone in this harsh territory were scarce as rain in August. The laundry sat on the edge of town where the Arkansas River rushed past, its waters feeding the massive washing vats that stayed perpetually hot from the fires burning beneath them. Hazel worked the ironing station near the window, a position she'd earned through sheer determination and an eye for detail that impressed even the stern Mrs. Miller. The work was grueling, 12 hours a day 6 days a week, but it beat the alternatives that other women in her circumstances faced. She kept her head down, her hands busy, and her dreams locked away where they couldn't hurt her. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a customer. Hazel didn't look up immediately, focused on navigating the iron around the intricate buttons of the shirt before her. She heard boots on the wooden floor, the distinctive jingle of spurs, and Mrs. Miller's practiced greeting. "Good afternoon, sir. What can we do for you today?" "Afternoon, madam. I've got a week's worth of shirts that need tending to." Been on the trail and they're more dust than fabric at this point. The voice was deep, warm like honey in tea, with an easy confidence that suggested a man comfortable in his own skin. Despite herself, Hazel glanced up. He stood near the counter, tall and broad-shouldered, his sun-darkened face partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, the kind who actually earned his living in the saddle rather than playing at it. He held a bundle wrapped in brown paper under one arm. When he shifted his weight, moving into the light streaming through the window, Hazel caught sight of his face fully and felt something flutter unexpectedly in her chest. He had strong features, weathered by wind and sun but not hardened by them. His eyes, she noticed even from across the room, were a striking blue-green, like the river in certain lights. A few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, and his dark hair curled slightly where it touched his collar. He looked to be in his mid-20s, perhaps 26 or 27, with the lean fitness of someone whose work kept him constantly moving. Mrs. Miller was examining the bundle he'd set on the counter. "These will need a good washing and pressing. We can have them ready by Friday." "I was hoping for sooner, madam. I've got business in Denver comes Monday morning and I need to look presentable." "Thursday evening at the earliest," Mrs. Miller said firmly. She believed in managing expectations. The cowboy's shoulders sagged slightly. "I understand. It's just that these are the only decent shirts I own, and I've got a meeting tomorrow with some potential buyers for the ranch's cattle. My boss is counting on me to make a good impression." Hazel found herself speaking before she fully considered it. "Mrs. Miller, if you'll permit me, I could stay late this evening and work on the gentlemen's shirts. I'm ahead on my regular assignments." Mrs. Miller turned to her with surprise. Hazel rarely volunteered for extra work, not because she was lazy but because she guarded her precious few free hours jealously. Those evening hours were when she could read the books she borrowed from the minister's wife or work on her own sewing projects. The cowboy turned too, and his eyes met Hazel's directly. His expression shifted from hope to something else, something that made her cheeks warm. She saw him really look at her, not the way some men looked through the laundry window, assessing her like she was goods for sale, but with genuine interest and what seemed like appreciation. "I couldn't ask you to do that," he said, addressing Hazel directly now, his voice softer. "I'm sure you've got better things to do with your evening than labor over a stranger's shirts." "It's no trouble," Hazel said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Truly, I know what it's like to need help when the stakes are high." Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding that went beyond the simple transaction of laundry services. Mrs. Miller cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Well, if Hazel is willing, then we can have 3 of your shirts ready by tomorrow afternoon. The rest will be ready Thursday as originally stated." The cowboy's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, revealing a warmth that made Hazel's heart skip. "That would be more than generous. I'm Franklin Norwood, by the way. I work at the Triple Creek Ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Hazel Darby," she replied, setting down her iron properly on its rest. "And you're welcome, Mr. Norwood." "Frank, please. Mr. Norwood makes me feel like I should be wearing spectacles and counting money behind a banker's desk." His smile widened. "And I couldn't be further from that life if I tried." Mrs. Miller completed the transaction, making note of which shirts were needed urgently. After Frank left, the older woman fixed Hazel with a knowing look. "That was unusually charitable of you." Hazel returned to her ironing, fighting to keep her expression neutral. "He seemed like he genuinely needed help. Besides, you're always saying we should provide good service to build the business." Hum. Mrs. Miller didn't sound convinced, but she let the matter drop. The rest of the afternoon passed in the usual rhythm of work. Hazel finished the Colonel's shirts, moved on to a stack of everyday work shirts from the boarding house, and helped sort the incoming washing that would be tackled the next morning. But her mind kept drifting to Frank Norwood, to the way he'd looked at her, to the warmth in his voice when he'd protested that she shouldn't trouble herself. She'd learned to be cautious with men. In the 3 years since she'd been alone, she'd received her share of attention, most of it unwanted. There was the banker's son who thought she should be grateful for his inappropriate advances. The merchant who'd suggested she could pay for groceries in ways other than money. The traveling salesman who'd cornered her in an alley until she'd threatened him with a broken bottle. She'd developed a hard shell, a way of looking through men rather than at them, of making herself unremarkable and uninteresting. But something about Frank Norwood had slipped past her defenses. Maybe it was the genuine dismay in his voice when he realized his request was an imposition. Maybe it was the way he'd spoken to her as an equal, not as someone beneath his notice or as prey to be pursued. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being alone, tired of having no one to share her thoughts with, tired of measuring her life in clean shirts and pressed collars. When the laundry closed at 6 o'clock, Hazel retrieved Frank's shirts from the sorting room. Mrs. Miller had already departed, trusting Hazel with the keys as she sometimes did. The building felt different in the growing dusk, intimate and quiet without the usual bustle of activity. Hazel lit the extra lamps and stoked the fire beneath the washing vat. Frank's shirts were indeed more dust than fabric, ground in dirt from hard riding and honest work. She filled a basin with hot water and strong soap, working the fabric carefully to avoid damaging the weave. As she washed, her mind wandered to what Frank's life might be like at the Triple Creek Ranch. She knew the place by reputation, a medium-sized cattle operation owned by an Eastern family who'd come west after the war. They had a good name for fair dealing and quality beef. What was Frank's role there? He'd mentioned meeting with buyers, which suggested he held some responsibility beyond simple cowhand duties. Perhaps he was a foreman or the ranch manager. He carried himself with natural authority, the kind that came from competence rather than arrogance. The washing took longer than expected. By the time she had the shirts rinsed and wrung out enough to iron, Full darkness had fallen outside. Hazel worked by lamplight, the iron hissing as she pressed it against the damp fabric. Steam rose around her like ghosts, and the repetitive motion became almost meditative. She was working on the second shirt when she heard a sound outside. Footsteps on the wooden walkway, hesitant, then stopping near the door. Hazel's heart jumped. The laundry was isolated at this hour, and she was alone. She reached for the heavy wooden pressing board, a poor weapon but better than nothing. A knock came at the door. "Miss Darby, it's Frank Norwood. I saw the lights still on and wanted to make sure everything was all right." Relief flooded through her. She set down the pressing board and went to the door, unlocking it but opening it only partway. Frank stood in the pool of light spilling from inside, his hat in his hands, looking concerned and a bit uncertain. "I'm fine," Hazel said. "Just working on your shirts as promised." "This late," he frowned. "Miss Darby, I truly didn't mean for you to work into the night on my account. I feel terrible about this." "It's my choice," Hazel said firmly, "and I said I would do it, so I am." Frank shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Could I at least come in and keep you company? Maybe help in some way? It doesn't seem right, you working alone at this hour while I'm sitting in my hotel room doing nothing." Hazel hesitated. Propriety suggested she should refuse. But propriety had never kept her warm or fed, and she found she wanted his company. "You can come in, but there's nothing for you to help with unless you know how to iron." "As a matter of fact, I do." Frank stepped inside, and she locked the door behind him. Spent 2 years after the Army working alone on a line shack-up in Wyoming Territory. Man learns to do for himself in situations like that. "You were in the Army." Hazel returned to her ironing station, and Frank followed, setting his hat on a nearby hook. "Briefly. Joined up when I was 18, full of romantic notions about adventure and seeing the frontier. Reality set in pretty quick. I wasn't cut out for taking orders that didn't make sense, and I had a sergeant who enjoyed making life difficult. Got out after my initial enlistment and never looked back." He rolled up his sleeves as he spoke, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with small scars that told stories of hard work and harder living. Hazel found another iron, heating it while Frank watched her technique with the current shirt. "You've got a good hand for that," he observed. "My shirts never looked half so neat when I did them myself." 3 years of practice," Hazel said. "Though I still remember my first day here. I scorched Mr. Peterson's Sunday shirt so badly Mrs. Miller had to buy him a new one out of her own pocket. I was certain she'd dismiss me. But she didn't. No. She said everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. She took the cost of the shirt out of my wages over the next month, which was fair, and I never scorched another one." Frank took the cooled iron she'd been using and one of his remaining shirts. "Where did you learn to iron before that?" "My mother taught me basic housekeeping, but nothing to the standard required here. She was a school teacher before she married my father. Her skills ran more toward reading and writing than domestic work." "Was?" Frank asked gently, picking up on her use of the past tense. "She passed 3 years ago. My father died in a mining accident that same year. That's what brought me to the laundry." Hazel kept her voice steady, though the grief still lived under her ribs like a stone. "I needed work, and Mrs. Miller was willing to take a chance on me." Frank was quiet for a moment, focusing on smoothing the iron over the shirt with surprising competence. "I'm sorry. That's a hard thing, losing both parents." "What about your family?" Hazel asked, wanting to shift the focus away from her own losses. "My father died when I was young. Fever took him during a bad winter. My mother remarried a few years later to a man who didn't care much for another man's son. I left home at 16 and have been making my own way since." He glanced up at her with a crooked smile. So I suppose we're both orphans in our way. Is that why you ended up cowboying? Seemed like the kind of work where a man could be judged by what he could do rather than where he came from. And I liked being outdoors, liked working with cattle and horses. There's an honesty to it. A cow doesn't care if you're rich or poor, educated or ignorant. It only cares if you know what you're doing. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the swish of irons and the occasional hiss of steam the only sounds. Hazel found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did around men. There was something peaceful about Frank's presence, something that made her feel safe rather than threatened. "So this meeting tomorrow," she ventured. "It's important to your boss, to all of us at the ranch, really. We're looking to contract with a new buyer, someone who'll take our full stock come fall. Mr. Henderson, he's the owner, he's depending on me to negotiate fair terms. I'm the foreman, so it falls to me to handle business when he's back east, which is most of the time these days. That's a lot of responsibility, I suppose, but I've been at Triple Creek for 5 years now, worked my way up from regular hand. Mr. Henderson trusts me to act in the ranch's interest." Frank finished the shirt he'd been working on and hung it carefully on a nearby rack. "What about you? Do you plan to stay at the laundry indefinitely?" The question touched something tender in Hazel's heart. "I don't know. It's steady work and that's worth a lot. But sometimes I think about what else might be possible. My mother always said I had a good head for figures, and I enjoy reading. Maybe I could teach, like she did, if I could get proper certification. What's stopping you? Money, mostly. And time. The certification requires study with someone already certified, and most teachers aren't willing to take on apprentices without payment. All my wages go to rent and food and saving what little I can for emergencies." She shrugged, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. "It's a comfortable cage, but it's still a cage." Frank's expression grew thoughtful. "My mother used to say something similar before she remarried. She felt trapped by circumstances, unable to see a way forward. That's partly why she married my stepfather, even though he wasn't a good man. She needed security more than she needed happiness. And you resented that. I did then. I was young and thought she should have been braver, should have found another way. But now I'm older and I understand better. Fear is a powerful thing, especially when you're responsible for a child and you're in a world that doesn't make things easy for women alone." Hazel looked at him with new appreciation. Most men in her experience didn't think about such things, didn't consider the particular challenges women faced. "That's surprisingly understanding of you. I've spent a lot of years watching and thinking about what I saw. Cowboys aren't all brawling and drinking, despite what the dime novels say. There's a lot of time to reflect when you're riding the range." They finished the last shirt together, with Frank holding the collar taut while Hazel pressed the iron along its edges. When she hung it on the rack with the others, she felt an unexpected sadness that the task was done. "Well, that's 3 shirts ready for your meeting," she said, busying herself with banking the fire beneath the washing vat. "You should make a good impression." Frank moved to help her, his presence close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent of him. "Miss Darby, Hazel, if I may be so bold, I'd like to thank you properly for this kindness. Would you allow me to buy you dinner tomorrow evening? Nothing fancy, just a meal at the hotel dining room to show my appreciation." Hazel's first instinct was to refuse. She'd learned to be careful, to keep men at arm's length. But when she looked at Frank's face, open and hopeful without any trace of the calculating look she'd learned to dread, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that. I finish work at 6 o'clock. I'll be here at 6:15 then, if that suits you." They gathered the finished shirts, carefully wrapped in clean paper, and Frank prepared to leave. At the door, he paused and turned back to her. You said earlier that you know what it's like to need help when the stakes are high. I want you to know that if you ever need help with anything, I hope you'll think of me. I mean that sincerely." Before Hazel could respond, he'd settled his hat on his head and stepped out into the night. She locked the door behind him and stood for a moment in the quiet laundry, her heart beating faster than it should. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Hazel tried to focus on her work, on the endless stream of shirts and sheets and everyday garments that needed her attention. But her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead, to Frank Norwood and the unexpected connection she'd felt with him. Mrs. Miller noticed her distraction. "You're going to scorch something if you don't pay attention, girl. Sorry." Hazel adjusted the iron's position, focusing on the mayor's Sunday shirt with renewed concentration. That cowboy really made an impression, didn't he? Hazel felt her cheeks warm. "He's just taking me to dinner as a thank you. It doesn't mean anything." "Of course not, Mrs." Miller's tone suggested she thought otherwise. "Just be careful, Hazel. Cowboys are wanderers by nature. They're here today and gone tomorrow." "I know that." And she did. She wasn't foolish enough to build castles on sand. But even knowing the risks, she couldn't quite suppress the flutter of excitement in her chest. Frank arrived at precisely 6:15, wearing one of the shirts she'd pressed and looking remarkably handsome with his jaw freshly shaved and his hair still damp from washing. He offered her his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and they walked together through the early evening streets of Salida. The town was quiet at this hour, most businesses closed or closing, families settling into their evening routines. The spring air carried the scent of wood smoke and the river, cool but not cold. Hazel had changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's and still carried memories in every stitch. "How did your meeting go?" she asked as they walked. Frank's face broke into a grin. "Better than expected. We struck a deal that'll be profitable for the ranch and give us room to expand our herd. Mr. Henderson will be pleased when I write to him." "I'm glad. You seemed worried about it last night." "I was." It's one thing to manage day-to-day operations, another to negotiate contracts that'll affect the ranch's future. But it worked out well. He glanced down at her. "And I looked presentable thanks to you." The hotel dining room was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and simple wooden furniture. The proprietor, a round man named Mr. Keller, greeted them warmly and showed them to a table by the window overlooking the main street. They ordered the evening special, roast chicken with potatoes and vegetables, and coffee that came strong and hot. As they ate, they talked with the ease of old friends rather than new acquaintances. Frank told her about life on the ranch, about the rhythm of the seasons and the satisfaction of seeing cattle thrive under good management. Hazel found herself telling him things she rarely shared, about her mother's love of poetry, about her father's laugh, about the small dreams she'd tucked away but never quite abandoned. "You should pursue the teaching," Frank said firmly when she mentioned it again. "You're clearly intelligent and articulate. You'd be good at it." "It's not that simple." "Why not? What if you had the money for certification? What would stop you then?" Hazel considered. "Fear, probably. Fear of failing, fear of trying and discovering I'm not good enough." "That's honest." Frank leaned back in his chair, studying her with those blue-green eyes. "But here's what I've learned in my years of working ranches. Fear is often a sign you're heading in the right direction. The things worth doing are usually the things that scare us." "Is that cowboy wisdom?" "That's life wisdom, earned through making enough mistakes to fill a canyon." His smile was self-deprecating. "I've tried plenty of things I wasn't good at, but I've also learned that staying stuck because you're afraid of failing is worse than failing itself." Their conversation ranged over many topics as the evening deepened. They discovered shared tastes in literature, both favoring adventure stories over romances. They argued good-naturedly about whether horses or cattle were more intelligent, with Frank defending cattle and Hazel taking the horse's side despite limited experience with either. They talked about their favorite seasons, Frank preferring fall and Hazel loving the hope of spring, and found common ground in their appreciation for winter's stark beauty. The dining room gradually emptied around them until they were the last guests remaining. Mr. Keller began making pointed sounds in the kitchen, and Frank caught the hint. "I suppose I should walk you home before they throw us out," he said with a laugh. Hazel lived in a boarding house on the far side of town, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. The walk took them through quiet streets lit by occasional lamps, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. "I have to go back to the ranch tomorrow," Frank said as they walked, "but I come to town most Saturdays for supplies. Would you allow me to call on you again?" Hazel's heart leapt. "I'd like that. I should warn you, I'm not much for fancy courtship. I don't have the words or the manners of an educated man." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Frank, I don't want fancy courtship. I want honesty and kindness, and I think you have both of those qualities in abundance." He looked at her with such warmth that she felt it down to her toes. "Then I'll be back on Saturday, and we'll see where this takes us if you're willing." "I'm willing." They'd reached the boarding house. Frank didn't try to kiss her, which Hazel appreciated. It was too soon for that, the connection between them still too new and fragile. Instead, he took her hand and held it gently for a moment. "Thank you for the evening, Hazel. It's been a long time since I've talked to someone like this. Thank you for dinner, and for listening." She watched him walk away, his tall form gradually swallowed by the darkness before going inside. Mrs. Patterson met her in the hallway with raised eyebrows. "That was quite the handsome young man who brought you home. His name is Frank Norwood. He works at the Triple Creek Ranch. MMM. Well, he looked respectable enough. But you be careful, dear. Men can seem one way in town and be quite different out in the wilderness." Hazel went to bed that night with her head full of possibilities, her heart lighter than it had been in years. True to his word, Frank appeared the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Through the late spring and into summer, he became a fixture in Hazel's life, a presence she found herself anticipating and cherishing. They fell into a pattern. Frank would finish his business in town, then collect Hazel from the laundry. Sometimes they'd have dinner at the hotel. Other times they'd walk along the river, talking as the water rushed past them. Once, memorably, Frank borrowed a wagon and took her on a picnic up into the mountains, where they ate sandwiches and watched eagles circle overhead. Through it all, Hazel felt herself opening like a flower toward the sun. Frank's steady presence, his genuine interest in her thoughts and dreams, his quiet strength all combined to make her feel valued in a way she'd never experienced before. He didn't try to change her or push her into being something she wasn't. He simply accepted her as she was and seemed to like what he found. For his part, Frank was clearly smitten. Hazel saw it in the way his face lit up when he caught sight of her, in the care he took to remember small details she mentioned, in the thoughtfulness of his gestures. He brought her wildflowers picked during his range rides. He found a book of Wordsworth's poetry that had belonged to his mother and gifted it to her, knowing she'd appreciate it. He listened with genuine attention when she talked about her work, treating her opinions and observations as worthy of respect. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were challenges, moments of friction that tested the growing bond between them. In July, a wealthy rancher's son named Robert Thompson arrived in Salida. ostensibly to look at horses but clearly interested in more than livestock. He saw Hazel at the laundry and began making regular appearances, bringing excessive amounts of laundry and making increasingly bold overtures despite her polite deflections. Frank witnessed one such encounter on a Saturday afternoon when he arrived to find Robert leaning against the laundry counter, blocking Hazel's path with his body while she clutched a basket of clean linens and tried to maintain professional courtesy. "The lady said she's not interested in having dinner with you," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying an edge Hazel had never heard before. Robert turned, his expression dismissive until he took in Frank's size and the set of his shoulders. "This isn't your business, cowhand. It is when the lady in question is courting me and you're making her uncomfortable." Frank didn't move closer, didn't make any threatening gestures, but something in his bearing changed. Hazel recognized the stillness of a man prepared for trouble. "Courting?" Robert's laugh was ugly. "You think a foreman's wages can compete with what I could offer her? Miss Darby, you're wasting your time with hired help when you could have a real future. Mr. Thompson, I've asked you repeatedly to respect my wishes. I'm not interested in your offers, whatever they might be. Please take your business elsewhere." Hazel's voice shook slightly but held firm. Robert's face flushed with anger. For a moment, Hazel thought he might cause a scene, but Frank took a single step forward, and that was apparently enough. Robert grabbed his package and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Frank turned to Hazel with concern clear on his face. "Has he been bothering you long?" "A few weeks. He's persistent, but I didn't think he was dangerous, just entitled." She set down the basket, her hands trembling slightly with the aftershock of confrontation. Frank closed the distance between them, and after a moment's hesitation, pulled her into a gentle embrace. It was the first time he'd held her, and Hazel melted into it, feeling protected and valued. "I don't like the idea of you dealing with men like that alone. It comes with the territory. You wouldn't believe some of the things men say when they think no one important is listening. I believe it, and I hate it." Frank pulled back enough to look at her face. "Hazel, I know it's early for this conversation, but my intentions toward you are serious. I'm not courting you for amusement or to pass the time. I'm courting you because I think you're remarkable and I want to build something real with you." Hazel's breath caught. "Frank, I feel the same way." "But what does that mean practically? You work at a ranch 5 miles from town, I work at the laundry. Our lives don't easily mesh." "They could, if we wanted them to." He traced her cheek with one calloused finger. "I'm not saying tomorrow or even next month. I'm just saying that I'm thinking about a future that includes you, if you're amenable to that." "I'm amenable," Hazel whispered. They were interrupted by Mrs. Miller's return from an errand, and the conversation had to end. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the depth of feeling they both harbored. August brought scorching heat that made the laundry nearly unbearable. The fires had to be kept burning for hot water, and the steam combined with the outdoor temperature to create conditions that left Hazel exhausted and drained by day's end. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her dresses hanging looser on her frame. Frank noticed immediately when he arrived one Saturday. "You look worn out. It's the heat. It'll pass when fall comes." But Frank frowned, clearly worried. "Is there any way to make the work easier? Can you take breaks during the hottest part of the day?" "We're too busy. Mrs. Miller can't afford to hire additional help, so we just push through." That evening, instead of their usual dinner, Frank took Hazel to the river. He'd brought a blanket and a basket of food, and they waded into the shallow water to cool off before eating. The cold water was a blessing, and Hazel felt some of her exhaustion wash away with the current. "I've been thinking," Frank said as they ate cold chicken and biscuits. "The Triple Creek has a position opening up. We need someone to manage the household, do the cooking and cleaning and such for the bunkhouse. It's lighter work than the laundry and it pays a bit better." Hazel stiffened. "Frank, if you're creating a position just for me, I'm not. Old Pete, who's been doing it, is retiring to live with his daughter in Denver. We genuinely need someone." He held up a hand to forestall her protest. "I'm not saying you should take it. I'm just saying it exists if you're interested. It would mean being at the ranch all the time. There's a small cabin that goes with the position. Private, separate from the bunkhouse. And before you ask, no, my living quarters are in the main house since I'm foreman. We wouldn't be living together if that's what concerns you." Hazel considered. The idea was tempting. Better pay, easier work, and she'd be closer to Frank. But she'd also be leaving Mrs. Miller, who had taken a chance on her when she desperately needed it. And she'd be leaving the independence of living in town, however limited that independence might be. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. There's no rush. Pete isn't leaving until October." Over the following weeks, Hazel wrestled with the decision. She talked to Mrs. Miller, who was understanding but clearly disappointed at the prospect of losing her best worker. She talked to Mrs. Patterson, who worried about Hazel's reputation living at a ranch full of men, even with a separate cabin. She even talked to Reverend Matthews and his wife, seeking their counsel. In the end, it was a conversation with Frank that decided her. They were sitting on the boarding house porch one evening in early September, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. The heat had finally broken, and the air carried the first hints of autumn's crispness. "I need to know something," Hazel said. "And I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Are you offering me this position because you genuinely think I'd be good at it, or because you want me close by? Because if it's the latter, if this is some kind of strategy to obligate me to you, I need to know now." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Both," he finally said. "I do think you'd be excellent at the work. You're organized, efficient, and you have a knack for managing difficult situations. The men would respect you, and the ranch would run better with someone competent handling domestic matters. But yes, I also want you close by. I'm tired of only seeing you 1 day a week. I'm tired of having to cram all my feelings and thoughts into a few hours before I have to ride back to the ranch." He turned to face her fully. "But Hazel, I would never try to obligate you to me. If you take this position and decide in a month or a year that you don't want to see me anymore, you'd still have the job. I give you my word on that. I want you to make this decision based on what's best for you, not on what I want." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, told Hazel everything she needed to know. "I'll take the position." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. You're right that I'm tired of only seeing you once a week. And beyond that, this is an opportunity to improve my circumstances, to save more money toward my goals. It makes practical sense." Frank's smile was brilliant in the starlight. "You start in October." "I start in October." He kissed her then, their first real kiss, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Hazel felt the world shift around her, felt the future open up with new possibilities. The transition to ranch life was easier than Hazel expected. The cabin Frank had mentioned was small but well built, with a bedroom, a sitting room, and a tiny kitchen. It had a stove, a comfortable bed, and windows that looked out toward the mountains. After 3 years in a single room at the boarding house, sharing facilities with a dozen other residents, the privacy felt luxurious. The work itself was substantial but manageable. She cooked meals for the ranch hands, did their laundry, kept the bunkhouse clean, and managed household supplies. The men were initially wary of her. uncertain how to behave around a woman in their territory. But Hazel had learned at the laundry how to be friendly without inviting familiarity, and she quickly established herself as capable and worthy of respect. She found she enjoyed aspects of the work more than she'd expected. Cooking for a dozen men with hearty appetites was challenging but satisfying, especially when they praised her efforts. She liked the rhythm of ranch life, the way the day's structure followed the needs of the animals and the land rather than arbitrary clock times. She appreciated the beauty of her surroundings, the mountains rising in the distance, the meadows dotted with cattle, the endless sky overhead. And then there was Frank. Seeing him daily, working alongside him in the daily operations of the ranch, deepened her understanding of who he was. She saw his patience with younger hands who were still learning, his firm but fair handling of discipline when needed, his dedication to the cattle and horses in his care. She saw the respect the other men gave him, earned through competence and character rather than demanded by position. They were careful about propriety. Frank didn't visit her cabin, and she didn't go to his quarters. They saw each other at meals and occasionally during the workday, but they saved their private time for walks in the evening or rides on Sunday afternoons, when Frank would saddle horses and take Hazel out to see different parts of the ranch. It was during one of these rides in late October, with the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, that Frank brought up the future directly. They'd stopped to rest the horses near a creek, and were sitting on sun-warmed rocks watching the water flow past. The air was cool but not cold, perfect autumn weather. "Hazel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." The seriousness in his tone made Hazel's heart quicken. "All right. We've been courting for 6 months now. In that time, my feelings for you have only grown stronger. I wake up thinking about you and I go to sleep the same way. You've become essential to my happiness, to my sense of what makes life worth living." He took her hand, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "I know it hasn't been long by some standards, but I'm 32 years old and I know my own mind. I want to marry you, Hazel. I want to build a life with you, have a family with you, grow old with you." Hazel's breath caught. She'd known this was coming, had hoped for it, but hearing the words still sent her heart racing. "But before you answer," Frank continued, "I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. I'm not a rich man. I make a decent wage as foreman, and I've saved carefully, but I can't offer you luxury or ease. Life as a foreman's wife would still mean work, would mean modest circumstances. And while Mr. Henderson has indicated he'd like me to buy into the ranch as a partner eventually, that's years away and far from certain. Frank, I've never wanted luxury. I want stability and partnership and love. I think we could have those things together. There's something else." Frank looked uncomfortable now. "I should tell you that I can't have children. Or rather, I probably can't. I had an injury years ago during my Army service that the doctor said would likely leave me unable to father children. I'm telling you this now because if having children is important to you, you deserve to know before you make any promises." Hazel processed this information carefully. She'd imagined having children someday, in the vague way young women do. But she'd also imagined staying unmarried, supporting herself indefinitely, and that future had seemed equally possible. Children were a hope, not a requirement. "Does it matter to you?" she asked. "The possibility of not having children? I'd be lying if I said I never thought about it. But what matters more to me is having you as my partner. If we're blessed with children, I'll be grateful. If we're not, I'll still have you, and that will be enough." "Then yes," Hazel said, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I'll marry you." Frank's expression transformed with joy. He pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, and Hazel felt the last of her carefully maintained defenses crumble. She was all in now, completely committed to this man and the future they would build together. They were married in November, a simple ceremony at the church in Salida with Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Patterson, and several hands from the ranch in attendance. Hazel wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Frank had bought her, cream-colored wool with touches of lace at the collar and cuffs. Frank wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but devastatingly handsome. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, and Mrs. Matthews cried through the whole thing. Mr. Henderson had returned from the East for the winter and gave them a generous wedding gift, a matched set of horses and enough money to furnish their home properly. Because the other part of their wedding gift was the foreman's house itself. Mr. Henderson announced that he was officially making Frank a junior partner in the ranch, with a 5% stake that would grow over time. It was an investment in Frank's years of loyal service and excellent management. The house wasn't large, but to Hazel, it felt like a palace after her years in the boarding house and months in the tiny cabin. It had a proper parlor, a kitchen with a modern stove, 2 bedrooms upstairs, and a front porch with a view of the mountains. Frank carried her over the threshold while the ranch hands hooted and hollered, and then they were alone for the first time as husband and wife. That night, Hazel discovered that Frank was as gentle and considerate in physical intimacy as he was in all other aspects of their relationship. He was patient with her inexperience, tender with her nervousness, and together, they figured out the rhythms of marriage with humor and affection. Life settled into a new pattern. Hazel still managed the household for the bunkhouse, but now she also maintained their own home and worked alongside Frank in managing ranch operations. She discovered she had a talent for bookkeeping and took over the ranch's accounts from Mr. Henderson, who was grateful to relinquish the task to someone more detail-oriented. The first winter of their marriage was hard. A blizzard in January trapped them for 3 days, and they survived on stored food and each other's company. A section of fence came down during a storm, and they lost a dozen cattle to wandering and predators before they could repair it. One of the hands broke his leg, and Hazel spent weeks helping him convalesce. But through it all, Hazel felt a contentment she'd never known before. She was building something real, something that mattered. She was part of a partnership where her contributions were valued and her voice was heard. And she was deeply, thoroughly in love with her husband. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. The cattle survived the winter in good condition, and the spring calves were healthy and numerous. Mr. Henderson's connections back east secured them excellent prices for their beef. The ranch prospered, and with prosperity came opportunities for expansion. In May, Hazel discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to hope, knowing what Frank had told her about his injury. When the doctor in Salida confirmed it, she rode back to the ranch in a daze of wonder and joy. She found Frank in the barn, working on a bridle that had broken. He looked up at her approach, and something in her expression must have given her away because he stood immediately. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything is perfectly, wonderfully right." She took his hands. "Frank, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." He stared at her as if he couldn't quite process the words. "Are you certain?" The doctor confirmed it. "He says I'm about 2 months along, which means the baby should come in December." Frank sat down hard on a hay bale, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I didn't think this could happen. I was so sure that I couldn't, but you can. We did. We're going to be parents, Frank." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. Hazel felt the dampness of his tears against her hair and held him back just as tightly. This man who had offered to smooth her troubles away, who had kept that promise in 1,000 small and large ways, was now giving her a gift she'd hardly dared to dream about. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Hazel continued working through the summer, though Frank became increasingly protective, insisting she avoid heavy lifting and take regular rests. The ranch hands treated her like precious china, which amused and sometimes frustrated her. She felt healthy and strong, blooming with the same vitality as the summer flowers in her garden. In December, during the first serious snow of the season, Hazel went into labor. Frank rode like a demon to fetch the doctor from Salida, and Mrs. Patterson came to stay with her until he returned. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. But when the sun rose on a brilliant winter morning, Hazel held their son in her arms. He was red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue-green eyes. Frank sat beside her on the bed, looking at the baby with an expression of such wonder and love that Hazel felt tears stream down her cheeks. "We need to name him," she said softly. "What do you think of Henry? It was your father's name." "Henry Norwood, I like it." She touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling at the perfection of his miniature fingers. "Frank, remember what you said to me that day at the laundry, about ironing your shirts," he smiled. "Iron mine and I'll smooth your troubles away. I was trying to be clever." "You succeeded." "You did smooth my troubles away. You gave me a home, a partnership, a family. You gave me everything I didn't even know I was hoping for. Hazel, you did the same for me. Before you, I was just going through motions, working and saving but not really living. You made me want more, made me believe I deserved more." Little Henry quieted in Hazel's arms, his eyes drifting closed. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the stove radiated warmth and the small house felt like the center of the universe. The years that followed were full of the ordinary magic of family life. Henry grew from baby to toddler to child, displaying a stubborn streak that reminded Hazel of herself and a gentleness that echoed his father. The ranch continued to prosper under Frank's management. Mr. Henderson increased Frank's partnership stake to 20%, acknowledging his essential role in the operation's success. When Henry was 3, Hazel gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Frank's mother. She was a placid baby where Henry had been fussy, content to watch the world with wide eyes and a solemn expression. 2 years after that came another son, James, who arrived early and small but fought his way to health with fierce determination. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family. Frank and the ranch hands added on 2 more bedrooms and a proper dining room. Hazel's garden grew to include vegetables that fed the family and flowers that fed her soul. She taught the children to read using the same methods her mother had used with her, finding joy in passing on that gift. Frank proved to be an exceptional father, patient and playful despite his serious nature. He taught Henry to ride almost before the boy could walk, and Margaret was equally fearless in the saddle. He told them stories around the fire on winter nights, tales of his adventures in the army and on the trail, carefully edited for young ears. In 1889, when Henry was 5 and Margaret 2, Mr. Henderson made Frank an equal partner in the Triple Creek Ranch. The older man was spending more time back east, preferring city life to the rigors of ranching, and he wanted to ensure the operation remained in capable hands. The papers were drawn up to give Frank first option to buy Henderson out entirely if he ever chose to sell. Hazel found herself teaching again, though not in the way she'd once imagined. Several ranch families approached her about educating their children, and she started holding classes 3 days a week in the bunkhouse's common room. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to a rotating group of 6 to 10 children. It wasn't the formal teaching position she'd once dreamed of, but it satisfied something deep inside her, that need to pass on knowledge and nurture young minds. The work was unpaid, but the families contributed what they could: eggs and vegetables and help with chores. More valuable than any payment was the satisfaction Hazel felt watching a child's face light up when they mastered a new skill or discovered a love of stories. Life wasn't without its sorrows and challenges. In 1890, Mrs. Miller passed away suddenly from a heart ailment. Hazel traveled to Salida for the funeral and wept for the woman who had given her a chance when she desperately needed one. The laundry was sold to new owners, and Hazel felt the loss of that connection to her past. The following year brought a hard winter that killed off a portion of their herd. Money was tight for months while they rebuilt their stock. Frank worked brutally long hours, and Hazel worried about the lines of stress that appeared around his eyes. But they weathered the difficulty together, and when spring finally came, they celebrated having survived with their partnership intact. In 1892, Mr. Henderson decided to sell his remaining stake in the ranch and retire to Philadelphia permanently. Frank and Hazel spent anxious weeks arranging financing through the bank in Salida, putting up everything they'd worked for as collateral. When the papers were finally signed making Frank sole owner of the Triple Creek Ranch, Hazel felt as if they'd climbed a mountain and finally reached the summit. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the front porch watching the stars. "Can you believe it?" Frank asked, his arm around her shoulders. "A kid who ran away from home at 16, who joined the army because he had nowhere else to go, now owns a ranch. If you told me 15 years ago that this would be my life, I'd have called you crazy. But you earned it, every bit of it. Through hard work and good decisions and refusing to give up." "We earned it," Frank corrected. "None of this would have happened without you. You're my partner in every sense of the word." Hazel leaned into him, content in a way that went bone deep. "Do you remember that night at the laundry when you offered to help me iron? I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, standing there in the lamplight with your sleeves rolled up and determination written all over your face. I remember wanting to know everything about you. I thought you were kind. That was unusual enough to catch my attention. Just kind." He sounded mock-offended, "and handsome, very handsome." She smiled up at him. "Frank, I want you to know that if I could go back and choose my life all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Every difficulty, every challenge, they were all worth it because they led me to you." Frank kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise renewed. "Iron mine and I'll smooth your troubles away. I meant it then and I mean it now. You've kept that promise, every day in 100 different ways." The years continued their steady march. Henry grew tall and serious, showing an aptitude for the ranching life that pleased Frank enormously. Margaret proved to have her mother's head for figures, and a stubborn independence that occasionally worried, but mostly delighted her parents. James was the dreamer of the family, more interested in books and drawing than cattle, and Hazel nurtured those interests even as Frank tried to teach him practical skills. In 1895, tragedy struck when a neighboring ranch suffered a barn fire that killed their livestock and destroyed their home. Frank organized the community response, and the Norwoods took in the displaced family for 3 months while their home was rebuilt. It was cramped and chaotic with 3 additional adults and 4 more children in the house, but it felt right to Hazel, like they were repaying the kindness the universe had shown them. The neighbor's daughter, a girl of 17 named Sarah, bonded with 12-year-old Henry during those months. Hazel and Frank exchanged knowing looks when they saw the youngsters sneaking glances at each other, both remembering their own courtship. Life cycled through its seasons. Births and deaths, good years and lean years, moments of joy and periods of grief. Through it all, Hazel and Frank's partnership remained the foundation everything else was built on. They argued occasionally, as all couples do, usually about money or how to handle the children. But they never went to bed angry, never let problems fester unaddressed. In 1900, as the new century dawned, they sat together at their kitchen table reviewing the ranch's books. The Triple Creek was solidly profitable now, with a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Frank had expanded their holdings, purchasing adjacent land when it became available, until they ran nearly 1,000 head of cattle on 5,000 acres. "We should think about succession planning," Frank said, tapping the ledger with his pencil. "Henry's 17 now, old enough to start taking on more responsibility. He'll need a few more years of seasoning before he's ready to run things," Hazel replied. "But yes, we should start bringing him into the business side more." "What about Margaret?" "She's got the keenest mind of any of the children. I've been thinking about sending her to normal school. She wants to teach, and she's certainly got the intelligence for it." Frank nodded. "And James, he's made it pretty clear ranching isn't his calling. Let him find his own path." "Not every son has to follow his father's footsteps." "Your mother would be proud of you," Frank said suddenly. "The way you've given all three of them the freedom to be who they are." "Our children," Hazel corrected. "And your father would be proud of you too. You've built something real and lasting." In 1903, Henry married Sarah in a ceremony that brought back memories of Hazel and Frank's own wedding 20 years earlier. The young couple moved into the foreman's house, the same one Hazel and Frank had started their married life in. Henry took on more of the day-to-day management of the ranch, freeing Frank to focus on expansion and long-term planning. Margaret left for normal school in Denver that same year, and Hazel felt the loss keenly. But she was proud too, proud that her daughter had the opportunities she herself had missed. They exchanged regular letters, and Margaret's enthusiasm for her studies shone through every word. James, at 14, was the last child still at home. He spent more time with his books than with the cattle, and Hazel encouraged his interests even when she could see it worried Frank. One evening, she found father and son in the barn having what looked like a tense conversation. "I just don't understand it," Frank was saying. "What kind of life can you make with art and poetry?" "Maybe not every life has to look like yours, Pa," James replied, his voice holding the particular frustration of a teenager trying to explain himself. "I love this place, but I want to see more of the world. I want to create things, not just manage them." "And how will you support yourself while you're creating?" Hazel intervened before the conversation could deteriorate further. "Frank, could I speak with you inside?" In their bedroom, she faced her husband with hands on her hips. "You can't force him to want what you want. I know that. But I'm worried, Hazel. The world is hard on dreamers. The world is hard on everyone. But we raised our children to think for themselves, to follow their own paths. You can't change the rules now just because you don't like the path James is choosing." Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair, now liberally streaked with gray. "I just want him to be happy, to be secure. Then support him in finding his own kind of security. We have the resources to help him pursue his dreams, just like we helped Margaret pursue hers." Eventually, Frank came around. He still didn't fully understand James's artistic aspirations, but he stopped fighting them. When James turned 18 and announced he wanted to go to art school in San Francisco, Frank helped him apply and agreed to support him financially for the first 2 years. The house felt empty with all 3 children gone. Hazel filled the space with her teaching, which had expanded to include nearly 20 children from surrounding ranches and farms. She converted one of the empty bedrooms into a proper schoolroom, complete with a chalkboard Frank installed for her. In 1908, Margaret returned from Denver with her teaching certificate and a fiancé, a serious young man named Thomas who taught mathematics. They married in June and took positions together at a school in Colorado Springs. Hazel attended the wedding with mixed feelings. Joy at her daughter's happiness mingled with the melancholy of watching her children build lives separate from her own. "This is how it's supposed to work," Frank reminded her that night. "We raise them to leave us." "I know. It doesn't make it easier." "No, but we still have each other." And they did. As their children's lives diverged and expanded, Hazel and Frank's partnership remained constant. They were both in their 50s now, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. Frank's joints ached in cold weather, and Hazel's hands sometimes cramped from arthritis. But they were healthy and active, still running the ranch together, though Henry handled more of the physical work. In 1909, Henry and Sarah welcomed their first child, a daughter named Hazel in honor of her grandmother. Holding the tiny infant, seeing Frank's features already visible in her small face, Hazel felt the circle of life close in a deeply satisfying way. She was a grandmother now, part of a chain of generations stretching backward to her own mother and forward to this new life. James returned from San Francisco in 1910 for a visit, bringing a portfolio of his artwork. His paintings were beautiful, vivid depictions of Western landscapes that captured the grandeur and harshness of the country in equal measure. Several galleries in San Francisco were showing his work, and he'd sold enough pieces to support himself. "I'm proud of you," Frank told his youngest son, examining a painting of the Triple Creek's meadows with genuine admiration. "I didn't understand what you were after, but I see it now. You're preserving something important." James's smile was worth all the years of tension and misunderstanding. The years between 1910 and 1920 brought changes large and small. Henry and Sarah had 2 more children, both boys. Margaret and Thomas had 3 children in rapid succession, keeping them busy and exhausted in the way of young parents everywhere. The ranch continued to prosper, weathering economic uncertainties through careful management and Frank's now legendary reputation for fair dealing. The Great War touched them despite their remote location. Several young men from surrounding ranches enlisted, and 2 didn't return. James, mercifully, was too old for the first draft and too essential as an artist documenting the West for later drafts to reach him. Hazel spent the war years organizing relief efforts, collecting clothing and supplies to send to the front. In 1920, Hazel turned 59 and Frank turned 65. They'd been married for 36 years, together for nearly 40. The Triple Creek Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres now, one of the most successful operations in Colorado. Henry ran the day-to-day operations with skill and confidence, freeing Frank for an increasingly advisory role. One spring evening, after a particularly beautiful day of sunshine and new grass, Frank suggested they take a ride like they used to. They saddled horses, both moving a bit stiffly but still capable, and rode out to the creek where Frank had proposed all those years ago. The aspens were leafing out, their pale green leaves fluttering in the breeze. The creek ran high with snowmelt, its music filling the air. They dismounted and sat on the same rocks they'd sat on decades earlier, though the rocks seemed harder now and their bones complained more. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked. "Choosing this life? You could have stayed in town, maybe eventually found a position teaching in a real school." "Never, not once." Hazel took his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "Frank, you gave me everything that matters. Love, partnership, a family, a home. You kept your promise about smoothing my troubles away. You did the same for me. I was drifting before you, just existing without really living. You gave me purpose beyond the work." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past. Two lives, joined and intertwined, made stronger by the joining. Hazel thought about the girl she'd been at 22, lonely and frightened and determined to survive. That girl could never have imagined this future, this richness of experience and emotion. "I'd like to come back here," Hazel said suddenly, "when my time comes. Scatter my ashes in this creek. Let me be part of this place forever." "Don't talk about that," Frank protested, but Hazel squeezed his hand. "I'm not being morbid, just practical. I want you to know my wishes, and I'd like the same for you when the time comes. We could both be part of this land we've loved and worked and built our lives on. Together even in death," Frank said softly. "I like that idea." The 1920s brought prosperity and change. The ranch adapted to new technologies, purchasing trucks to supplement wagons and investing in modern equipment that made work easier. Hazel's school expanded again, and she began training younger women to teach, passing on both pedagogy and her mother's educational philosophy. Margaret visited regularly with her growing family, and Thomas proved to have a gift for ranching that delighted Frank, even though teaching remained his primary calling. James married in 1925, a fellow artist named Rebecca who shared his passion for capturing the West on canvas. They settled in Santa Fe, where the art community was flourishing, and produced both paintings and children with equal enthusiasm. Their wedding brought the whole family together for the first time in years, a raucous celebration that lasted 3 days and reminded Hazel of everything she and Frank had built. In 1928, Hazel turned 67 and decided it was time to retire from formal teaching. Her hands were too stiff now for writing on the chalkboard for hours, and she tired more easily. She passed the school to 2 of her former students, young women she'd trained and who carried on her methods and philosophy. Frank had mostly retired as well, spending his days in an advisory role to Henry, and puttering in the workshop he'd built, crafting small items of woodwork that he gave away to family and friends. They'd earned their rest, both agreed, though neither could fully step away from the ranch that had become so thoroughly part of their identities. The stock market crash of 1929 and subsequent depression tested the ranch's stability but didn't break it. Frank's decades of conservative financial management meant they had reserves to weather the storm. They kept all their hands employed even when it meant tightening belts, and Hazel organized efforts to help struggling neighbors. The community they'd been part of building pulled together, sharing resources and supporting each other through the lean years. In 1933, celebrating 50 years since they'd met, Frank and Hazel hosted a party that brought together children, grandchildren, ranch hands past and present, and friends from across the region. Hazel looked around at the gathering, at the evidence of the life they'd built together, and felt a satisfaction deeper than words could express. That night, alone in their bedroom after everyone had left or bedded down, Frank pulled her close. 50 years since you agreed to stay late and iron my shirts. 50 years since you promised to smooth my troubles away. I've tried to keep that promise. You have, every day." Hazel rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "We've had a good life, Frank. The best life, because I got to live it with you." The 1930s rolled on. Henry's children grew and began taking on ranch responsibilities. Margaret's oldest daughter came to stay with them for a summer and fell in love with ranch life, eventually returning permanently to work alongside her uncle. James and Rebecca's paintings gained national recognition, appearing in galleries and museums. In 1938, Frank turned 83. He was still mobile and mentally sharp, but Hazel could see him slowing down. He napped more frequently, and some mornings it took him longer to get moving. She was 77 herself, feeling the weight of her years in aching joints and failing eyesight. But they were still together, still partners, still finding joy in daily life. That fall, on a perfect October day with the aspens blazing gold, Frank suggested one more ride to their special place by the creek. Hazel hesitated, worried about the physical demands, but something in his expression convinced her. They saddled horses with Henry's help, both needing assistance mounting that would have embarrassed them decades earlier. The ride took longer than it used to, requiring several rest stops. But they made it to the creek, to their rocks, and sat together watching the water flow past just as they had so many times before. "I'm tired, Hazel," Frank said quietly. "Not just today, but deep tired, the kind that doesn't go away with rest." She knew what he meant because she felt it too. The tiredness that came from a long life fully lived, from decades of work and worry and joy and sorrow. It wasn't depression or illness, just the natural winding down of a life's arc. "I know, I feel it too." "I don't regret a single day," Frank said firmly. "Not one. If I could live it all over, I'd make the same choices, love the same woman, build the same life." "So would I." Hazel leaned against him, and they sat in silence as the sun moved across the sky and the creek sang its eternal song. Frank died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, in the bed he'd shared with Hazel for 55 years. She woke in the early morning to find him gone, his face peaceful and the half-smile he always wore when he looked at her still on his lips. She held his cooling hand and wept, grieving the loss while simultaneously grateful that he'd been spared a long decline. The funeral brought family and friends from across the state. Henry gave a eulogy that captured his father's quiet strength and unwavering integrity. Margaret spoke about the lessons he'd taught about respecting every person's path. James read a poem he'd written about his father teaching him to see the beauty in everyday things. And Hazel, though she'd planned to stay silent, found herself standing to speak. Frank Norwood walked into Miller's Laundry in Salida on an afternoon in 1883 and changed the course of my life. He offered to help when he didn't have to, showed kindness when the world had taught me to expect otherwise, and kept every promise he ever made. He smoothed my troubles away, just like he said he would, and he gave me a life beyond anything I dared to dream. I was blessed beyond measure to be his wife, his partner, and his friend. And though my heart is broken now, I wouldn't trade this pain for never having known him. The love was worth the grief. They scattered his ashes in the creek, as he'd wanted. Hazel watched the water carry away the physical remains of the man she'd loved for more than half a century, while his memory remained vivid and alive in her heart. She lived another 2 years, staying in the ranch house where every corner held memories. Her children wanted her to come live with them, worried about her being alone, but Hazel refused. She wasn't really alone, she told them. Frank's presence remained palpable in the house they'd built together, in the land they'd worked together, in the family they'd created together. She spent her remaining time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories and family history. She wrote letters to each of her children and grandchildren, to be opened after her death, telling them what they'd meant to her and what she hoped for their futures. She put her affairs in order with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd brought to everything else in her life. On a spring morning in 1941, Hazel Norwood passed away in her sleep, just as Frank had. She was found by her granddaughter Hazel, come to visit for the weekend, lying peacefully in her bed with a smile on her face and a letter to Frank clutched in her hand. The letter, read at her funeral, said simply, "I'm coming home to you, my love. I've missed you every day since you left, and I'm ready to be together again. Wait for me by the creek. I'll find you there." They scattered her ashes with Frank's as she'd requested. And if the family members gathered by the creek felt a peculiar sense of peace and rightness, as if two souls had finally reunited, none of them remarked on it. Some things were better left to faith and feeling. The Triple Creek Ranch continued under Henry's leadership and eventually passed to his children. The house Frank and Hazel built remained the family home, expanded and modernized over the decades, but retaining its essential character. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carried forward the values they'd embodied: hard work, integrity, kindness, and the understanding that true wealth is measured in relationships rather than money. On clear autumn days, when the aspens turned gold and the creek ran high, family members would sometimes ride out to that special spot and sit on the sun-warmed rocks. They'd think about the couple who'd met in a laundry in 1883, about a promise made and kept, about love that endured across decades and beyond death. And they'd feel grateful for the legacy of love and partnership that continued to shape their lives generations later. The story of Hazel and Frank became family legend, told and retold with variations, but always keeping the essential truth: that two people who had every reason to remain isolated and guarded chose instead to risk their hearts, to build something together, and in doing so created a legacy that outlasted their mortal lives. Their love story wasn't dramatic or flashy, but it was real and deep and lasting, which in the end was worth more than all the romance and adventure the dime novels could offer. Years turned into decades, and the world changed around the Triple Creek Ranch in ways Hazel and Frank could never have imagined. But the land remained, the creek still sang its song, and the mountains stood eternal in the distance. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments of dawn or dusk, it seemed like two figures could be seen sitting by the creek, hands intertwined and heads bent together, well, some things transcended the boundaries between worlds. Love, true and deep and freely given, was one of those things. It had transformed two lonely people into partners, built a ranch and a family, and left ripples that continued to spread outward long after the original stone had been cast into the water. Hazel had agreed to iron Frank's shirts, and he had smoothed her troubles away. But more than that, they had chosen each other, day after day for more than 50 years, and that choice had made all the difference.